Thank you, Roy. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to share with you my thoughts on the issue of the prospects for continued U.S. predominance in Asia. I think the answer to the question of whether the United States will be able to maintain its preeminence for the foreseeable future, of course, being defined as 2025, if not beyond, is actually not hard to answer. The short answer to that is yes. The United States will maintain its predominance in Asia beyond the years 2025. But it is a hard question to answer in the 10 minutes that I have. So I'm going to try and do my best to answer it through a series of headlines and a series of summary statements. If you look at the United States today and prospectively in comparison to all the competitors that you can imagine would be out there in this emerging Asian century, and assess what the Chinese figuratively call the comprehensive national power of each of these entities, there is simply no other political entity in the international system that matches the United States where it comes to comprehensive national power, both in terms of breadth and in terms of depth. The United States still stands head and shoulders over many of the others who we often think of as being potential rivals to the United States for hegemony, however that term is understood. What I want to talk about today is to give you some sense of why I think that state of affairs is likely to persist. And I want to do that through an analytical device that is quite popular in neoclassical economics. When one thinks in terms of maintaining primacy or preponderance or predominance or hegemony, whatever labels one chooses to use, I think one has to look at two dimensions of the power equation: the inputs that lead to the production of national power and the output of national power, which for purposes of simplicity today, I'm simply going to equate with military power. Now, obviously, there are all sorts of limitations to this kind of a construct, but at least it's a good enough first step to start a conversation. So I want to talk about the United States from both these dimensions: the inputs that make the United States particularly strong, in fact formidable, and the outputs which are its military power. And I want to scope how I think the patterns appear in this time period that I've been asked to reflect upon. When one looks at the inputs, the question of can the United States sustain the economic engine that allows it to maintain its predominant geopolitical position, the question we are implicitly asking is whether the United States can sustain relatively high rates of economic growth. And relative in this context is relative to two variables: relative to others and relative to its own condition as being a mature economic power. Can the United States sustain its economic growth in a sustained fashion? To answer that question, you have to look at three dimensions or three elements that contribute to American capacity. First, the American ability to sustain capital accumulation uninterruptedly over time. The ability of the United States to grow its labor force, because capital and labor are two critical components in any economic model. And the third is the capacity of the United States to engage in technological innovation. These are the three dimensions that one needs to look at closely. And when one looks at these three dimensions, on at least two of the three, there is nothing but very impressive data to back up the claim that the United States can sustain its relative status in the international system for some time to come. Let me start quickly with the issue of technological innovation. There's simply no other country in the world that has the velocity of innovation that is manifested in the United States. And whether you take statistics like patent indicators, whether you look at the character of the leading sectors in the global economy, whether you look at the scale and the depth of national resources applied to research and development, the United States stands head and shoulders over the rest and shows no signs of retreating. When you add other elements, like the quality of American tertiary education and the availability of risk capital, particularly through a mature venture capital system, I think if you were a betting man or a betting woman, it would be safe to say that the United States will be able to maintain its capacity to innovate technologically, which is probably the single most dramatic constituent of growth over the long term, indefinitely. And certainly over the period 2025, I don't see any challenger that could match the United States. When one looks at the second element, labor force growth, the story is equally optimistic. The US has a large population. It's a population that is certainly aging relative to the population that we had, for example, say in 1950, but the demographic profile is still extremely favorable. I did a back of the envelope calculation on the way here, and it appears that even as far out as the year 2050, fully 53% of the American population will be somewhere between the ages of 20 to 64. That is in the productive cohort of their lives. And of course, if we do suffer demographic reverses for any particular reason, the US has the great safety valve, which has been effective for the last 2 centuries, and that is not simply access to immigration, but actually a welcoming social system that welcomes immigration. And so if you think of labor force growth as being a very important component of a state's ability to maintain economic growth over the secular period, the United States, relative to many of the other great powers in the international system, simply has unrivaled advantages. It's in the third dimension of the constituents of growth that we do run potentially into a problem, and that is the American capacity to accumulate capital. And much has been made of this challenge, particularly in the last 30 years, when the US has moved gradually from being a creditor nation to being a debtor nation. But I'm really not as pessimistic as many of those who currently comment on this issue in our political system, because I tend to look at current US difficulties with respect to capital accumulation, which is a kind of cute way of saying that we consume too much and we save too little, as really a rational response to a very peculiar global economic system. And the rational response basically derives from 3 important facets of the global system which permit us to sustain this behavior. First, the dollar happens to be the international reserve currency. And that allows the United States the luxury of being able to borrow endlessly with minimal penalties. Second, the less developing countries of the world, because of the weaknesses of their own economies, are more than eager to recycle their savings and make those available to the United States, even when the rates of return on those savings in the United States are less than the rates of return they probably could achieve if they invested them in investment and consumption at home. And as long as this behavior persists in many of the less developing countries of the world, there is no reason why the United States should deviate from its current patterns of reduced saving and overconsumption. And the third reality, which is a reality that we often tend to forget, is that for all our troubles, the United States still happens to be the most attractive investment destination anywhere in the world. And you can see that simply in the behavior of bond markets in the last 2 years, when our capacity to draw up deficits has simply been unprecedented. So when one looks at these input ends and looks at these three variables, technological change, labor force growth, and capacity to accumulate resources, capital accumulation, the United States does very well. Now, to my mind, we have the ability to sustain growth precisely because the conditions that have allowed us to do so well are likely to persist for some time to come. And even with respect to the issues of capital accumulation, which, as I pointed out, are the most problematic of the three, there are three possible endings, only one of which is terribly problematic for Washington. The first is you could get a progressive re-equilibration. And that progressive re-equilibration could come about if the less developed world begins to consume more and save less. If that happens, American consumers will respond rationally and save more and consume less, as in fact they have been doing in the last year since the financial crisis. You could get a managed re-equilibration, a la Plaza II Accord. I wouldn't put too much faith in that because the coordination costs of pulling off such an agreement today are extremely high. And lest we forget, even the less developed countries in the world who are recycling their savings to the United States stand to benefit from the current asymmetry where they save and we consume. And so getting them to change their behaviors through a managed process is likely to be more difficult than people think. And of course, you could get a third outcome, which would be singularly bad for us, and that is a forced re-equilibration caused about through a crisis that involves a loss of confidence in the dollar. The reason why I'm not particularly fearful that this last outcome might materialize is because there are very few alternatives to the dollar today as an international reserve currency. And that again becomes an implicit benefit that the United States can exploit for yet some time to come. The real challenges that the United States really is going to face is less in the area of economics and more in the area of politics. The weaknesses of our national decision-making system and our inability to replace what are often perverse incentives with more attractive incentives. But if I were given a choice of trading our problems for the problems that afflict some of our competitors, I wouldn't make that trade. Let me say a few words about the output end, American military power, which I described as being a critical component of what preponderance in Asia and the global system will mean. I'm simply going to give you headlines. I'm going to give you the headlines in terms of 5 basic propositions. From now, as long as the eye can see, if the eye can see up to 2025, I will argue that the United States will maintain an unprecedented spectrum of military capabilities that span the ability to dominate from the lowest to the highest levels of violence. 2, the United States alone will have the capacity to engage in military action autonomously when it chooses to, and the United States alone will have the capacity to maintain high-intensity military operations at a great distance from the homeland indefinitely. The United States, 3, will still have very robust command of the commons, and it will be the only state that will have global ISR capabilities of a kind that will remain unmatched if you look at the military acquisition programs in most of our competitors till at least 2020, if not 2025. The United States, 4th, will still be able to maintain a huge military budget, which today is roughly half the military budgets of the entire global system, and will be able to do it at still a relatively low GDP burden. And 5th, the United States, as long as it pursues reasonably wise policies, will enjoy the presence of friends and allies who will augment American military power with their own and will continue to demand American political presence in the regions that they are located in. Given all these facts, I think American military predominance will remain a fact of life. This doesn't mean we're going to win every war. This doesn't mean that we are assured that we will have wise policies. But it does mean, at least in a static sense, if one is looking at the rank ordering of capabilities in the global system, the United States will still remain preeminent for a long time to come. What does this mean in terms of a net assessment? I want to leave you with just 3 thoughts. The US will continue to be a vital component of Asia's continuing economic miracle, and it will remain the key provider of public goods in the region. Second, we will see rivals to the United States with growing military capabilities, including capabilities that will threaten the US military's ability to maintain access in different parts of Pacific Asia. It will make the American power projection task more difficult, but not impossible, particularly if the US is alert enough to investing in the technical antidotes that are required to sustain its capacity to maintain these tasks. Third, and finally, as long as the US maintains its commitment to sustaining an open global economic system and continues to free up its own internal economy of the rigidities that currently affect it, the global division of labor at an economic level favors the United States. And so if we can get that last missing piece, wise national policy, smart national decision-making, there is absolutely no reason why American predominance ought to be a fact of the past, even if the realities of the future portend an Asian century.
Thank you, Ashley.